So we've pulled together a panel to help us understand what's happening, literally to look at the data of what's going on and what we know today. Secondly, to then talk about, okay, why has it happened? What are the factors contributing to this? And then lastly, to talk about what we can do to learn about this for the future, to apply to the future, whether it's through the duration of this pandemic or just building operations in general going forward. So we have a really super panel today to help unpack all of that. We have John Gilbert, who's the Executive Vice President and COO of the Rudin Management Company. We have Shannon Kaplan, who's an engineer at the AKF Group. And we have Thomas Baade-Mathiesen, who's the Vice President of Corporate Engagements at Altanova, and also the chair of the CoreNet Sustainability Committee. So let's get right into it and start with our first speaker, who is John Gilbert with Rudin Management. John, good morning, and thank you for joining us. Help us understand that you have tremendous data here on this particular issue. Help us unpack exactly what has happened and what's going on right now in buildings that you see from your perspective.
Well, I think we can show some data in terms of where we've been, John, which might help tell the story. If you go to the next slide, I think this one tells everything. We're going back to that. We're looking at February 24th through April 3rd. You can see that the week of March 8th, and this is representing occupancy in the Rudin portfolio. As you can see, typically in early March or late February, early March, we were hitting a little over 21,000 people. As we went into mid-March, you can see that March 15th week, when the governor issued the stay-at-home mandate, what happened to occupancy across our portfolio. We literally went from 21,000 to almost zero. And if you go to the next slide, so this shows during that same period what happened to electric demand. And you can see a precipitous drop, although if you can go back to the occupancy curve for a second, that really went, we were going 120 miles an hour, we went to zero. Now, if we go to energy, electric demand, you can see, yeah, we were going 120 miles an hour, but we really went back to like 80. So that, when the team did the analysis and brought that to me, they said it was basically a 30% drop in, almost 100% drop in occupancy, but only a 30% drop in electric demand. And you can see this illustrated right here. This is aggregate demand across the Rudin portfolio. We can then take a look, if you flip ahead. So let's just go into 345 Park. So now we're going to jump to June, right? June 22nd was the big opening. We were ready to have a big party. And as you can see, less than 200 people showed up at a building where on a normal day, there'd be 5,000. So what was the impact on electric demand? So here's our electric demand curve. The dotted line would be your typical predictive curve. And you can see that we've literally lost that. Since we're not able to correlate occupancy, since there is no occupancy, we've lost that dip in the middle of the day where we take advantage of slowing down our fans as we need to push less air across the building based upon occupancy. That red horizontal line is actually our peak demand. If you go to the next slide. So here you can see, John, what you were looking at, which is, okay, what is our savings calculator based upon a normal baseline, which you can see in the orange there, and then the blue is what the actual was for June 22nd through the 26th. And as you can see on that upper left, that represents about a 41, little over 41, almost 41.5% decrease in consumption, both on the dollars. And then as we jump, yeah, go ahead, you can jump to, so now we're into Labor Day week. You can see where we were June 22nd, we were around 200 people. Now we're so excited, we're at 400 people, going to almost 900 by the week of September 13th through the 20th. And then we can also then look at what happened to electric demand for that period. Again, these are weeks that you're seeing here that look like fingers jutting up. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Friday is always lower. So this is our electric demand from September 1st through the 30th of this year. And as you can see, the predictive curve is so much higher than the actual curve, representing a 30 to 40% decrease in electric demand. If you go to the next slide, again, this shows the actual, it's a 35% decrease. If you flip ahead again, so this is our entire portfolio in terms of the fourth quarter of this year. These are all individual buildings. These are occupancy aggregate. So we're pushing almost 3,000 on a good day, which is certainly better than where we were, but not anywhere close to the 21,000, which is kind of our normal. If you flip ahead again, this shows the same time period for electric demand. Again, wow, that's not an insignificant amount of electricity that's being utilized. But clearly what this shows is that when you have a work from home strategy, there are things in the office that need to be left on. Networks need to be operated, servers, routers, hubs, the ability to air conditioning to keep all of that infrastructure cool and humming. And I think if you go to the next slide, I think is really kind of interesting. So this is just more occupancy. Now we're into fourth quarter. You can flip ahead, Caitlin, if you would. Go one more. So here we are. So again, for that same quarter, we're, another 33% decrease, almost 34% on the dollar standpoint. If you flip ahead, so this I think is the most interesting, John, where we're actually able to, in real time, calculate where we are from a carbon production standpoint and a GHG emission standpoint. That green bar is what we're actually producing from a carbon standpoint. The orange bar is where we need to be to meet the mandates of Local Law 97 by 2024. And then the blue bar, you can see that's where we need to be at 2030. So good news is we're in good shape for 2024, but look at how much work we've got to do to get to those 2030 emissions. And that's why I think working with our tenants and working with our customers is the only way we're going to achieve that decrease in carbon, absent the ability to purchase renewable energy, which would then bring our carbon intensity down to zero. So, I think if the question that you posed is an interesting one, why are we using more energy as relates to occupancy? And it's really a function of all the things that have to be kept on in the office to support a work from home environment.
Well, John, thanks for that great baseline and that data to level set the discussion today. Let's just talk about today for a minute. So roughly what's the occupancy of your portfolio this morning, and what's going on with energy?
I can pull that right up. If you give me a second, I can give you the actual real time. Let's see. My instincts are that we're going to be right close to what we showed, but let me just get there. Yeah, we're right about occupancy is in the 250 range right now as we speak at 345 Park. And energy is, again, the same charts that I just showed you for the fourth quarter, in terms of what we're able to, to see there. So roughly right now, what you're seeing, John, is roughly then, if I remember, about a 80% drop in occupancy, but just a 30% drop in energy. That's correct. Yeah, call it 34 or 35%.
Okay, right. Well, this is excellent data. We're going to come back in the roundtable part and pick this apart more. I'd like to now move to Shannon Kaplan with the AKF Group. Shannon's an engineer there. Shannon, thanks for joining us. AKF has some really interesting data to help us understand, now that we have the baseline from John on, okay, exactly what has been going on with buildings. Shannon's going to help us look a little bit at, okay, why maybe is that happening and what's actually going on in buildings while the occupancy is down. So we're thrilled that Shannon has joined us today for the discussion. Shannon, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. All right, if you want to go to the next slide. So what's been really interesting is I think that everybody had an assumption as we rapidly changed our lifestyles that there was going to be things that would just happen automatically. And one of those was that obviously all of the energy usage was just going to shift to the residential side because suddenly everybody was at home. And while I'm certain that there has been an increase in residential energy, what we're going to look a little bit at today is some specifics on 2 different offices and what happened, and kind of take a look at why the energy savings in the office side wasn't at the level that people might have just instinctively thought they would be. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Millersville University. They have a building called the Lombardo Welcome Center that we worked on with them. It is a building that has been a certified net positive energy building. And as part of that whole process, we installed a ton of metering there and have been able to pull out a lot of data. This is a look at some of the information from their metering system, looking both at mechanical loads and plug loads. We don't have the lighting data here, but this building is very automated. The mechanical systems run off of the occupancy sensors, so they're gonna kind of just stay at baseline temps throughout the day. The plug loads, some of those are managed by occupancy, some of them not. But you can see here that in March, things were going full tilt at this building. And then by the first week in April is when they started going to work from home. You can see there was a couple days in there. It really highlights on here where some people came in anyway in April, and then in May, it was totally quiet. So this building had very little occupancy from the second week of April all the way through until the end of June. And we noticed this huge pattern. I know there's some anomalies that you see in the data. In talking with them, that was actually when they had some building security checks going on to make sure everything was safe, since they suddenly didn't have anybody in the building. But it was a dramatic shift in what we saw in terms of energy usage. In taking a look and in talking over this with Millersville, we started to look at what was the total impact. It looked pretty significant on those graphs, but at the end of the day, it wasn't adding up to being as much energy savings as we thought. Here's a look at how they were doing year over year in terms of their positive energy generation. In the first year, we did a great job. We did even better in the second year because they got much better at understanding how to run this building. So this is a look at a group that has full control over every aspect of the building and has been learning to improve how to use it. But you can see as we got in through August, in year 3, yes, we were generating even more energy, surplus energy than we had in year 2, but not of the amount that you would have thought, given that May and June and July were all pretty unoccupied months. I happen to have a snapshot from their dashboard, which is publicly available if you're ever interested in looking at it, from December 4th in 2019 that I happened to grab for some other presentation. And then I took one yesterday on December 7th. We can take a look at this and see what the actual energy usage has been across the whole building versus the PV production. Obviously, the PV production and the energy use are going to vary some based on weather. But what I found really interesting is I can see on here that energy dip that started in May. You can see that May is trending, and June and July trend. By July, they were starting to occupy again. But May and June definitely are trending lower. But at the end of the day, this was only resulting in a net savings over the course of 1 year of about 8.8%. So for 3 months of an unoccupied building scenario, we would have likely expected more. To dig into this a little further, we actually started to take a look at what was going on in our own office. We have a lot of metering in our Philadelphia office. That's all centered around plug load only. The building manages the lighting and HVAC, so that's not something that we as tenants have control over. I want to point out in here 2 particular color groups. The orange group is our desks. It's all of the workstations that we have. And the purple band that you see, the larger purple band, that is our pantry. So this is a typical week in November of 2019. We can clearly identify the weekdays. Obviously, Monday was our busiest day with people starting to travel out to job sites. On Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday being our quietest day, our office happens to have a Flex Friday policy, so we typically have reduced occupancy in the office. But we see what we expect, you know, the peak coming when people arrive, going throughout the day, dropping off, and having this kind of baseline load throughout. That's going to represent, you know, some of those constant loads, vampire loads from computers and such, refrigerators running, and all of those basic things. So then we wanted to take a look at what was going to happen in the same space another week. This is November in 2020. Now, at this point, we had the occasional staff member coming in, but we were, similar to the previous presentation, seeing a significant reduction in occupancy. In this particular office, we were possibly having 1 or 2 people coming in. So you'll notice that all of those peaks have been eliminated. There's no way to really tell here which day of the week is which. And what you'll notice is that that purple band that represents the pantry has shown a significant decrease. We can actually start to really see when the refrigeration cycles are kicking on and off with that refrigerator. There's 2 of them in that pantry, because it's showing up as spikes because the usage overall in the pantry is down so much. But the desk load has a very steady band. It is less than what we were seeing before in terms of spikes, but really what that comes down to is that people aren't there to turn on monitors. However, in our office scenario, what we found is that the majority of the staff is remote desktoping into PCs. So that PC load is still there. It's still being realized. And we've also found that with the change in people's work behaviors, that load spiking is actually more distributed because we have people working an extended number of hours, not necessarily that they're working more, but when they're choosing to work has varied a little bit more as they've had some flexibility of moving to working from home. I took a shot at trying to put these on top of each other. I didn't have a huge amount of time to mess with the graphics, but just to try and see where we were at. And what we found is that overall, the baseline load of what we were seeing in our kind of downtimes pre-COVID is pretty close to what we're seeing as kind of the steady load across the time frame for the time when we are in COVID. So what we've really, only thing we've really managed to do is shave out those peaks that are happening from some of the specific equipment that people are using. So if we take a look at this on plug loads and understand that there's an inherent base load built into every building, and we understand that it's highly likely, I know for this particular office building, it's a multi-tenant building, and there were other tenants that were having to come in throughout because they were considered essential services. So the building wasn't really able to ramp down mechanical systems and lighting systems like it might have been if it was a scenario like Millersville where they fully controlled all of the systems and knew the full schedule of all the occupants and that all the occupants were out. So what we've really found is that in this time of COVID, everybody has focused a lot more on how to make things work at home. And there hasn't been a lot of mental energy and effort spent yet on how to turn that work from home into realized energy savings in our office buildings. It became a lot more about how to make sure we could do what we needed to do in different locations, as opposed to focusing on the energy savings that we could be taking advantage of in those main office locations.
Well, Shannon, thank you so much for that. So if we're reading the data correctly, then in your particular office scenario, the largest remaining plug load is the desktop. It's the computer that, in your case, if you're not cloud-based, then the computer has to stay on for people to sync with it remotely. Is that true?
It does, yeah. So while the monitors aren't on and people aren't there charging cell phones or plugging other miscellaneous things into their desk, those desktop computers are there. They are running, and they are still running all of the processing because we're just remotely connecting to them. So as far as the actual tower is concerned, there might as well be somebody sitting in that seat.
And then in the case of the university example you showed us, what was still running in the building if nobody was there and they could control everything?
So it was a very interesting conversation, and we're actually planning on looking into it further with them. They have an entire campus portfolio that they have to manage. And in starting to talk with them, they said that they ended up expending a lot of effort on their facility side at having to do a lot of work to change schedules and programming for a lot of their buildings. They felt that this building was their most sophisticated building for controls. They knew a lot of it was tied to occupancy, so they just didn't worry about it. they didn't go in and change set points. They're like, you know what, it's going to do a better job than most of our buildings, so we're going to put our effort where we think we'll get the most impact, and therefore this building just kind of got left on its own. They didn't go and reduce daytime set points and stuff like that. So the other thing we talked about with them was that the timing of when they were off happened to be from April in through June, and that's actually a swing season. So that's not the time when our mechanical systems are going to see the most intense usage. So the opportunity for savings was already reduced just due to the timing of when they weren't there.
Got it. Well, thank you, Shannon. We're going to bring you back in a moment for more of a roundtable discussion. But next, I want to turn to introduce Thomas Baade-Mathiesen, who's the Vice President of Corporate Engagements at Altanova and Chair of the CoreNet Sustainability Committee. Thomas, before we get to you, I just want to remind the audience that we will be moving to Q&A in about 10-15 minutes. To do that, use your Q&A button on the screen. Type in whatever question you might like, and there's the opportunity there for you to vote up questions that you see from other people in the audience if you like. So Thomas, thanks for joining us. First of all, for those that aren't familiar, tell us about CoreNet and the Sustainability Committee and the work that you do there.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. If you don't mind, I'll also just loop in Altanova as well, because that's where I'll be tying in a lot of my comments from. But CoreNet, in brief, is the largest organization of the largest users of real estate in the world, and New York happens to be the largest chapter. So we're really talking, large corporate tenants. The Sustainability Committee has been created to bring together all of the different types of players that we have within this organization. So it's the corporate tenants, end users, and then we have lots of different types of service providers from the design side, whether it's engineer, architect, project management. We have other solution providers, furniture, etc., and some specialists like myself that come from the sustainability consulting angle. Just briefly, on that angle that I'll be speaking mainly from today, Altanova, sustainability consulting firm focused on real estate strategy and technology. So I work a lot with corporations, and I thought what would be interesting today is really to bring in that view from the corporate side. What's actually going on when we consider the corporate tenants in relation to what we heard with technology and before that, the building.
Thanks. So what are you hearing? I mean, what conversations are you aware of that tenants and users are starting to have with building owners, or what conversations do you think they should be having given the data that we've seen?
Very good question. So, well, there's a lot happening. I think one of the interesting things, maybe some will find it provocative, but I think that, one of the big takeaways that I personally had from this is that in some senses, we aren't talking about things that are completely new. We're just getting a new perspective that is clearer, that we have this challenge and opportunity to get smarter about our energy consumption. Everyone left and it's still there, so what's going on? If I were to talk how I would generally view this, I would view it on a few different levels. I think it's very helpful. You can just, open your hand and think about it in terms of 5 points. And those are related to the tenant, but they're also related to the landlord. And so you can actually also forge collaborations on these. There's a level of data and data collection. And by the way, it's phenomenal to see, the data that was already presented. I think that these are from top cases. It's from a top building owner and operator. It's from, a top engineer in a top tenant space. And what's actually going on when it comes to the greater New York City is that a lot of data isn't actually being collected at all. So I think that's very important. There's the data side. There's the analysis side. Once you have the data, are you even doing analysis with it? There's a third point, which is the decision making. Are we making decisions on the basis of that data and analysis, which was also alluded to at the end of the last presentation? And then the fourth point is really, are we tying this, for the decisions to happen, are we tying that to the responsibilities? Are we tying it to the business drivers? Because if we're not, chances are high that those decision makers will focus their attention elsewhere where the responsibilities and incentives are clear. And the last one that I'd like to add is a matter of headspace, which was also just previously mentioned, and I think it's so important. During COVID, we were all overwhelmed from all these different points of view, and so the question is, how can we be very clear-headed about this when it comes to boiling down the message to the core and presenting it in a way that is clear, from the boiler room, which gets very technical, to the boardroom, which gets very strategic. And my observation is that unfortunately, there are a lot of things not happening on these 5 levels: data, analysis, decision-making, tying it to responsibility, and incentives, and then also clearing the headspace around it. So, I could go in depth with some examples, but I don't want to.
No, but maybe, it strikes me that the members of CoreNet, which is a great organization, and I want to thank you for inviting me to speak on a number of occasions. Many of the CoreNet members are companies that have their own ESG sustainability goals. And so it's not like they're not tuned into these issues. They have very aggressive and admirable goals. Yet in this period, we have this disconnect that we're discussing today. What's the best way to engage tenants to make them know that this is going on in exploration is, can the tenant do anything here to help?
Well, you bring up a very good point, which is these large corporate goals, which are often driven quite top down. It might even be from investor level, knocking on the door of their portfolio company. Hey, what are you guys doing in this regard? And then it goes down from there. But what we've seen from our experience is that energy efficiency isn't necessarily the first way of approaching a carbon reduction commitment, for example. Very many people have been going to renewable energy procurement, for example, and offsets and such. And then somewhere in the mix, they will also be pursuing energy efficiency. But so what can really be done there? I think it is about, you'd be surprised, even quite advanced corporations don't necessarily have a standardized benchmark across their portfolio of how their sites are consuming energy. So there isn't a comparative view to act on. And therefore you can't necessarily get very prioritized on types of equipment to act on, or even specific sites to act on. And when you don't have that, it is, as you can imagine, kind of tricky to go ahead and do the analysis and decision making. You did ask about the landlord side, and I think there's a phenomenal opportunity to bring the two sides together. And in some cases, the landlord can actually be the expert on site. They know what's going on in this city, in this location, with this building and this weather pattern. And, a lot can be done, especially in the start, when the two sides meet for the first time and set expectations. There is definitely an opportunity to add more language in the lease. And it's important that this feels of mutual interest, so that both sides disclose their carbon or energy or sustainability commitments, and try and find ways that they can inform each other and collaborate to try and find a way that benefits both sides' targets. But there's also information packages that maybe when a new tenant, for example, moves to town or is establishing a new HQ in the building, maybe the landlord can inform about certain design goals or decisions that could be considered as they start thinking about their fit out. You know, there are fantastic incentive opportunities out there right now from both New York State and CoreNet that pick up the bill for doing things, despite having very advanced corporate tenants. They don't. The corporate tenants aren't necessarily familiar with the local incentives because they often speak at a portfolio view. There are too many different local programs to learn about across the world to become an expert on them. So, learning about some of these local circumstances can be very, very beneficial. And if there is some form of guidance and, information that can be shared with them as they start planning their projects, then the rest will follow through the design and the operation.
Great. Well, thank you for that. It's a great framing. I'd like to bring back Shannon and John so that we can kind of all have a discussion together about this. We've seen a lot of data. Thomas has brought an interesting perspective about how we can think about it from a tenant perspective. Maybe just for a couple minutes here before we turn to the audience Q&A and encourage the audience to continue to submit it. What do we learn from this? Like, what do we apply going forward? Whether it's the next several months while we're still in this circumstance with the pandemic, are there things that can happen now to make a difference? Or certainly in the future, what can we learn from this moment in time to apply to buildings generally?
Well, I think,
John, you want to go?
Yeah, I think number one, what's the split between plug load and base load or core load of a building? And typically it's 60% is on the tenant, 40% is on the core of the building. So as we acknowledge that, we have to, what jumps right out at you is that if we're really going to solve, the issue of carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, then these two groups have to work together. And I think Thomas said it right. There has to be a sharing of data between owner and tenant that ultimately enables that tenant to really understand what their responsibilities are, ultimately what they can do to decrease that consumption and thus decrease the production of greenhouse gases. And if we're not working together, then we'll never get to where we need to get based upon the mandates of Local Law 97.
John, have any tenants voluntarily approached you that have recognized what's going on to ask what they could do?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a very interesting dynamic going on right now. Had we not had COVID, the number of CEOs of major corporations that lined up at the Davos summit in January of this year saying that they want to get to carbon neutral, carbon zero was amazing. And the first call that many of these CEOs or at least people who work for them should be making is to the property owner in which they occupy space. So we've had multiple inquiries coming from large customers. Number one, how do I purchase renewable energy, right? Because when you really look at Local Law 97, yeah, we all have to make our buildings more efficient, but the net of it is how do we procure renewable energy? And if you look at what JP Morgan Chase announced about a month ago, where they're going to take 90% of their load and they're going to, supply that from river run small hydro in upstate New York from Brookfield Renewables. I mean, that's an unbelievable statement. Now, what they also did there, and Nantum is right in the middle of that, is you take real-time supply data, you match that with real-time electric demand data, you blockchain that. So now I have an immutable ledger when the regulators come knocking on my door and say, hey, did you really consume this energy? Did you really buy it? Where'd you use it? You can show them that. What it also then allows, John, is the tokenization of that. So as Local Law 97 at least focuses on a study of carbon trading, but now you have a level playing field where carbon intensity, as it's tokenized, can then be traded within a portfolio, outside a portfolio. So now you've just totally changed the math and the return on investment of any type of ECMs, energy conservation measures, that either a corporation or an owner might be contemplating.
Thanks. That's a really great example that you just helped walk us through. Shannon, how about from your perspective, what do you think we can learn to apply to the future based on what we've seen?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we can learn, and I think one of the biggest things is you have to really understand how this all happened. This wasn't something that everybody conscientiously decided they were going to do. It wasn't like the world said, let's all work from home tomorrow and we're going to do it for 9 months. It started out as, this is a 2-week thing, maybe 3. It was the short thing. And if you think about it, like if you're at your house and you're going to go away for a long weekend or even a week vacation, sure, you might set the thermostat back, but that's it. You're not defrosting your refrigerator, emptying all the contents, unplugging TVs, cable boxes. But if you knew you were going to be gone for your house for a year, you'd probably make different decisions. You would go through a lot more effort. You would turn off the hot water heater. You would do all of these things because it didn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to do the effort for the short term. It may make sense to do the effort for the long term. And I think part of what happened is we became fixated on where we needed to be. It was always temporary. It's remained this ambiguous time frame. And I think it also got harder when we started saying people can come back. But suddenly we have systems that are designed to be all or nothing kind of systems to a point. There are some granular pieces, but you have 5 people walking around in an office designed for 200, and they're all now sitting in different areas because we want them to stay apart. So even if you've got occupancy sensor-based lighting systems, those 5 people alone are driving enough of that light on that it's not showing you the energy savings that you might have seen. So I think the real lesson learned is, how do we start to think about things a little differently? How do we make sure that as we're designing spaces, that if a company is going to be gone for a month, that the landlord can actually ramp down that zone only without impacting the neighboring space that may have essential workers that have to be there. I think we just got caught really off guard by this. And then the fact that it was this temporary thing that's been dragging on, that we've had some people come in and out, has really limited our ability to manage this on an energy side. And we honestly haven't been thinking about it that much either, because there's been so much else going on, so many other worries and anxieties, that it has just not been at the forefront of our minds.
That's a great way to frame it, Shannon. Thank you. Thomas, we're going to get to questions in just a minute here, but any thoughts from you on what we can learn here to apply to the future?
Yeah, I mean, you may find that this is not concrete and that it's high level, but I really feel that this is where the majority of the impact can be done on the tenant side. And it's really finding the value behind this. If there's no value in it, there's no investment and action on it. And I, have literally sat down with, second and third level leadership of corporations to try and figure, why is this valuable, from a financial perspective? So maybe there are savings or access to capital. Reputational perspective, maybe it's stakeholders, whether it's employees or the market. And from an operational point of view, like if we optimize these systems for one side, energy, maybe we can optimize them for health and well-being at the same time. When that is clear in their mind, which it very often isn't until you've gone through the education of it, there won't be the goals because there wasn't any value. But now suddenly there is clear value about it. And if it's too large to go at global level to do this, you can still do it at local management level. That's one way. And the other way that I would recommend is leverage some NYSERDA incentives to get an analysis of the space and inform yourself, bottom up, like what's actually going on in here. and what can we do about it? Those would be 2 recommendations.
Okay, Thomas, thanks. Let's get to the questions. We've got some great questions here. We'll jump to the first one here that actually got 4 upvotes. So it's at the top of the list. And question here from Lance Brown is, in a typical multi-tenant office building where the base controls is HVAC, it seems that the landlord and tenant would have to work together to set back HVAC systems and allocate the cost savings that result. Absent any explicit discussion of doing so, the implicit expectation would be that the landlord would maintain temperature and ventilation at full occupied levels. Is this the case?
No. I mean, I guess, at least with as we have Nantum, Nantum obviously, and I think it's interesting in terms of the Millersville University case, what type of analytics and what type of machine learning and AI rides above all of this data. So for instance, in a Rudin building, we've had a situation at 40 East 52nd Street, major tenant, BlackRock, basically came to us, we started sharing data, and they immediately began to ask for modifications to the lease because we were providing them with conditioned air at 7 a.m., but then showing them that their people weren't showing up until 8:45. Then they're like, why are you giving me all of this conditioned air from 7 a.m. to 8:45 a.m. in the morning? We don't want it. And we're like, great. The reason why we're giving it to you is because you asked for it when we negotiated the lease. Let's amend the lease. Same thing on Saturday mornings where we were providing, conditioned air to 16 floors from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. in the afternoon. And they basically said, we're going to create 2 hot desking floors, only give us to those 2 floors. So there's a perfect example where you're going to decrease substantially the amount of energy that you're using to condition air based upon an owner talking to a tenant and a tenant seeing data that ultimately can begin to modify the behavior and their corporate strategy from a sustainability standpoint. So yeah, no, there's systems out there. Nantum is clearly an example of that, where we're looking and using very granular data to influence the amount of energy we use and the amount of greenhouse gas that we produce.
But so on the issue of HVAC, so of the 70% base load that's still going on while occupancy is down, how much of that is HVAC?
Good majority of it. I think in the multi-tenant situation where, I think it was said earlier, either by Thomas or Shannon, where, if you've got 3 people showing up on a floor where there's usually 500, you're still running that chiller is still operating. Now you can gauge it from an occupancy standpoint, but net, you're still got to cover that base. And if it's really warm out, during the summer hours and you're really conditioning that air, then you're using electricity. The other thing to remember too is that as more and more people focus on ventilation and they focus on filtration, and you up those to MERV 15 level filters, you've got to use more electricity to actually push that air through those filters because they're by definition finer and they catch more particles.
Maybe keeping with the same vein for a moment, I'll just jump down to the question below here, and it's on this issue of granular loads that we're just talking about right now. How can building design and construction change to support more granular loads? These 5 people who are only 5, but in 5 different parts of the office. Shannon, any thoughts on, what may change from a design standpoint going forward?
Sure. I think there's going to be a lot that's going to have to go into this. Everybody talks about the new normal. I'm starting to call it the future normal because we don't know yet what that's going to be. But I think we've all learned from this that the future normal is going to be different than what we had before all of this happened. There's a lot of talk about more people staying remote. There's, de-densification, increased ventilation. There's a lot of things that are going to come out of this. And I think with that is going to come a change in general strategy to how offices are laid out, how they're managed. As we start to talk about what it might mean for people to work from home, we're likely going to find that the reason people are coming into the office is to see other people. So we may get to a point where we're rethinking everything. We're rethinking the standard hours of an office. We're rethinking days. It could be that a company only has their office open 4 days a week and could work with a landlord and saying, we just don't even need this office conditioned on this day because it's just a day that our whole company is going to be remote. I think it will take to John's point, renegotiating some of those contract terms that were based on this expectation of full occupancy during core hours and everybody feeling like they wanted to be able to count on that. I think we'll also, have to think about how those building systems are set up. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be about getting away from having larger pieces of equipment, but thinking about how those pieces of equipment may be connected to the distribution so that we can actually ramp up the number of pieces of equipment that we need to suit the load and not make it just be this piece of equipment is dedicated to this large chunk of the building and it's all or nothing for that area. So I think we're just going to have to rethink how we're functioning as offices, how we're functioning in our design in terms of planning for the needs and making everything be a lot more scalable at kind of a building level so that we can send stuff to where it's needed when it's needed instead of kind of an all or nothing strategy.
Here's a question from Christine on phantom loads. Are property owners like Rudin analyzing usage patterns overnight and off hours? John, what can you tell us about phantom loads?
Yeah, we're analyzing them in real time. We don't wait for overnight. We basically identified using machine learning what the predictive curves look like. I can tell you what tomorrow's load will look like to about a 95% level of accuracy. So we don't wait until overnight or off hours. We do it right in the middle of the day, and we alarm these curves so that if something is heading in the wrong way, and we're not talking about water, but use water as an example, where suddenly I'm seeing water consumption spike, I know I probably have a leak somewhere. So we're utilizing that to focus in on other, scarce resources like water to focus on ultimately what the building has remembered or what Nantum has remembered for the building in terms of consumption levels. And when those get out of whack and there's anomalies, those are alarmed and we go fix those right away.
Sophie wants to know about shared energy savings agreements. This is an interesting question about, how do you encourage data sharing between landlords and tenants, and how do you get tenants to share their data? Thomas, any thoughts on that, and your view about shared energy savings agreements?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it begins again with the priority. If there's a priority from the top that this needs to become part of the site selection, the broker needs to include this in their vocabulary when they're also helping negotiate the lease, then suddenly this is going to become a lot more important. And chances are high it's also going to happen. So at that point, you can start discussing, well, what are the landlord's goals here? What are the tenant's goals here? Oh, is there a match? And in that case, maybe we can make some mutual, sharing of data. Maybe we can have our systems interconnect in some way and speak with each other. Maybe we can even have some fun, more gamified efforts where we involve the employees somehow in doing what they call, for example, a treasure hunt to figure out, well, who switched this off, etc., and make it a little bit of a competition, whether it's between tenants or teams within the tenant. I guess that's just a sort of short answer to get started.
Great, thanks. Another question here, interesting one. One possible reason behind the energy disconnect could be the equipment running at lower efficiencies at low loads brought by low occupancy. Shannon, do you have any thoughts on that? Are we trying to run systems that are meant to be going full speed and have to ramp them back and therefore are sacrificing efficiency?
Yeah, it's certainly something to consider. And I think, as we take a look at buildings that have made changes to the way that their systems are running to use occupancy-based methods, CO2 monitoring, occupancy sensors being connected, what's happening is that as those occupancies have dropped way down, we're going to see that there's less of a demand being put on the equipment. The equipment's still on notice that it needs to be able to provide what could be called for, but it's not being called on to do that. So that's why I was talking about the way to rethink how we're connecting these so that perhaps if you have a chiller, and you may have had one per a set of floors before, and it was just kind of dedicated, that instead it becomes them all running in parallel. So you could actually shut off an entire chiller if the demand was down and just add that chiller back in if the demand were to increase, as a way of keeping the one chiller that might be needed all the time running at max efficiency, as opposed to having 3 or 4 chillers running all at reduced efficiency trying to satisfy this load. Because we can get to a point where what the demand is being called for is so much less than what's expected that the system really has to do something crazy like turn on and off with a lot more frequency in order to kind of balance out what's being called for on the demand side.
Well, along the same lines here, the next question is, if we want to submeter, what do we submeter? What are the right things? Who wants to take that?
I would say the right things, it depends on what you're interested in looking at the end of the day. I mean, submetering is absolutely fascinating, but it does come with a cost. So I would make sure that you know what you're going to do with the data. It could be as simple as really understanding large chunks, which would save you money in what you'd be metering, but you need to make sure they're meaningful chunks. Just randomly selecting a series of circuits that has a water heater in a kitchen plus 5 desks plus a conference room on it isn't going to tell you a whole lot of useful information, because you can't understand the difference in those loads. So when we look at it on the tenant level, we try and either do every circuit and then make sure that the way that the system's wired, that those circuits are really clean, like this is all desks, this is all lights. Or we try and at least grab bigger loads. So maybe it just becomes, we're only going to meter these panels, but this panel can only have lighting. This panel can only have ancillary mechanical things like a data room, AC units and stuff like that. Something that will allow you to take action off of the data and make analysis from the data.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, John, as you design space now, these issues become very, very important. And that's why picking a good MEP engineer is crucial, that they're aligned with your concerns as a tenant, ultimately to really bring the data home in a way that's A, organized, B, that can be sliced and diced in a way that is valuable, and C, that there's so much money that can be saved up front as you design your space and do it properly, so you don't have to try to retrofit at the back end, which can be messy and expensive.
And to even add on that,
yep.
Sophie just asked the previous question. She's from the NYSERDA Commercial Tenant Program. They provide a funding package for MEPs or sustainability consulting firms to do that job that John just pointed out, to make sure that these things can be integrated and to show what's the payback of doing so and how would you most effectively do it, and then helping see that through the designs.
Great, we're going to try to get through 2 more questions quickly. So next one is from Cecil. Based on Shannon's previous answer, how would grouping occupancy for certain days make a difference, since it appears the savings on unoccupied days are not nearly as great as hoped? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, my thought with that statement was simply that if you knew for a fact that you were going to have nobody in the office on Fridays, and you communicated that and coordinated that with your landlord and said, hey, you control the lighting, you control the heating, put our space in weekend mode for Friday through Sunday. Don't turn our lights on, really kind of ramp it down. Have people make sure that when they're done, because we know we're not going to need it. It was very interesting, even though we kind of saw this coming. A lot of people didn't really see it coming. Even in our own offices, many of us left on a Friday thinking, that the following week we'd be doing a test remote from home day. And suddenly we get this notice that that's it, it's totally remote. As we've had people go back in, we literally found like a piece of pizza on somebody's desk that they had expected to come in and be able to deal with that they didn't. People were not prepared. So I think if we're very conscientious about this and we know that that's a day that we're not going to be there, we can be more prepared. We can all commit to it. We can communicate that with the landlord, and we can make real changes to our building schedule for that space for that day.
Yeah, John, I would answer that question from a more macro standpoint, and that everybody says data is the new oil. but it's crude oil. And unless you have software that can refine that data, that can organize that data, that can ultimately begin to predict and prescribe what you should be doing with that data, then your data is just gooey, thick, and useless. So, you really, as you, design your space, pick a good engineer. Obviously, Shannon is on her game big time. Look at ultimately what your goals are in terms of sustainability and what you're really trying to accomplish. And then, obviously pick an owner that understands this, is into this, and is utilizing software that can ultimately provide you with some very interesting insights. What we know for sure, the more granular the data we get with good software, the more valuable it becomes. Full stop.
Okay, last question. We're running out of time. So, John, I'm going to stay with you 20 seconds. It's a great question because I see it all the time. It has to do with, a small issue. We can see several office buildings, large and small, with lights on all night, possibly all day with no tenants. This was the case before COVID. What can be done? I'm actually here, John, in your building here at 55 Broad, looking across the street. There are 3 full floors with nobody in them, and the lights are fully on. I can see it right now. I see it all the time. Is that a tenant requirement, or why does that happen?
Well, generally, it's a tenant requirement, depending upon how the building is wired and how it's lit. Generally, we do not control lighting within our tenant space. Mm-hmm. That's the tenant's responsibility. Obviously, if there's cleaners in there when no one's in there, that's kind of a strange question. Again, it'd take a little bit more, research into why that's happening. But I know it's something that bothers me. It's no different than apartment building windows being open in the middle of the winter when it's below freezing. It drives me crazy.
All right. Well, I want to thank the panel, Thomas and Shannon and John. Thanks for the great discussion and the data and the richness of the answers. I've learned a lot. I hope the audience has too. So big round of applause to our panel. Caitlin, maybe we can go to the next slide. So I want to call everybody's attention to another great program coming up next week, Urban Green Live, episode 7 on December 17th. This is our live video podcast series. We have Doreen Harris, who is the acting president and CEO of NYSERDA, who's going to talk to us about what's next for energy efficiency and renewables. I'll be asking her questions. This is your opportunity to ask her questions live too, so I invite you to tune into that. And speaking of NYSERDA, let me wrap up today with another special guest, who's Ryan. Ryan's joined us, Ryan Baxter. Thank you so much. Ryan's going to talk to us about a prop tech challenge that's actually very related to the discussion that we just had. So Ryan, take it away.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John, Gilbert, Shannon, and Thomas for a really, really great discussion. I'm Ryan Baxter, prop tech advisor to NYSERDA, New York City community growth lead to MetaProp, and a co-founder of the Prop Tech Challenge. Happy New York City Real Estate Tech Week. And today I want to tell you a little bit about the NYSERDA Tenant Energy Data Challenge. The Prop Tech Challenge started at a hackathon when we realized that there are lots of awesome people who can't physically show up sometimes. But the goal has always been to help innovative folks connect with New York City real estate. And ultimately, this challenge focuses on helping you connect on this very topic. The NYSERDA Tenant Energy Data Challenge ultimately provides, thanks to an awesome tenant, 2.5 years of real tenant submeter data from 7 floors in Midtown Manhattan. And their landlord was so awesome that they included some building-wide BMS data, including occupancy count. And so our hope is that you all, having heard all of this, will be inspired to share some thinking on what to do with this data to inform better decision-making. The competition centers on your ability to predict what happened in this real Midtown Manhattan office on August 31st of this year. Submissions are due on February 12th, 2021 through the Prop Tech Challenge websites. And ultimately, all of this is thanks to our partners in this, Real Estate Board of New York, Connected Real Estate Magazine, and of course, NYSERDA. Please check out the PropTech Challenge website if this at all sounds interesting to you. Again, there is real world data available for download right now. It's been downloaded just over 30 times so far, but we're hoping to 10x that in advance of February. Thank you so much.